Millionaire leaves pregnant black woman over his mother's lies. Next morning, divorce papers destroy him. Dorian Caldwell sat in his glass-walled office high above Atlanta, his hands shaking as he stared at the divorce papers spread across his desk. His navy suit jacket hung open, his tie was loose, and the polished man the city once admired looked broken. The Atlanta skyline glittered through the windows, but it could not hide the emptiness in his eyes. His face was streaked with tears, his hair slightly out of place, and his breathing unsteady. For years, he had built a name that carried weight in every boardroom and charity hall. But none of that mattered now. The woman he once loved had walked away, and the daughter he had barely known would grow up without him. Not because of betrayal from Sabrina, but because of the lies whispered by the one person he trusted most, his own mother. How did it all collapse so quickly? How could a man with everything lose it all in a single strike of deception? Would you have forgiven Sabrina if you were in her place? Welcome back, our amazing viewers. Your return to our channel fills our hearts with gratitude, and every comment. We'd love to know, where in this beautiful world are you watching from today? If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. Your support is the fuel that drives our passion to create compelling stories that matter. Each subscription tells us we're on the right path, and every comment reminds us why we do what we do. I want to share a blessing with you. May your day be filled with moments of joy, and may peace settle gently in your heart. Whatever challenges you're facing, may you find the strength to overcome them, and may tomorrow bring you closer to your dreams. Get ready because another captivating story is coming your way, one that will inspire and enlighten you. Remember, you are loved, and you are always welcome in our community. Whether you're catching up on our previous videos or eagerly waiting for what's next, know that you're part of something special here. Now let's begin. Dorian Caldwell had attended countless charity events in Atlanta, but the night he first saw Sabrina Mitchell was different. The ballroom at the High Museum of Art shimmered with crystal lights and the hum of polished conversation. Yet Dorian's attention was drawn not to the speeches or the dinner tables but to the woman standing near one of the exhibits. She wore a dark green dress that highlighted her confidence and quiet elegance. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, yet people seemed drawn to her. Sabrina was an architect with a growing reputation for bold, environmentally conscious designs. That night, she was speaking passionately to a small group about her work on affordable housing projects in underserved neighborhoods. Dorian listened from a short distance, intrigued. Here was someone who didn't orbit the same social circles he had grown used to. She wasn't dazzled by wealth or status. She was focused on making her city stronger. When their eyes finally met, the connection was immediate. Dorian introduced himself, expecting the polite acknowledgement most people gave him. Instead, Sabrina challenged him about Caldwell Properties developments. She asked why his firm hadn't invested more in green building methods or affordable projects. Rather than shrinking from her directness, Dorian admired it. Their conversation stretched through the evening, shifting from architecture to family, from community work to personal dreams. That night was the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted. Dorian called her 2 days later, not to impress her with dinner at a 5-star restaurant, but to walk the Atlanta Beltline with her on a quiet Saturday morning. Sabrina arrived in jeans and sneakers, her hair pulled back, carrying a notebook filled with sketches of her latest project. They spent hours walking, stopping at murals and local cafes, discussing how design could reflect fairness and dignity. Dorian found himself drawn to her vision and to her refusal to compromise her values. Their courtship unfolded across the city. At the historic Fox Theater, Dorian arranged tickets to a performance he knew Sabrina had long wanted to see. At Virginia Highland, they wandered from shop to shop, blending into the neighborhood crowd instead of standing apart as people of his status often did. For Sabrina, these moments mattered more than his wealth or reputation. She wanted authenticity, and Dorian gave it freely. Months passed, and their bond deepened. Sabrina invited Dorian to visit one of her community projects in a modest neighborhood outside the city center. He traded his tailored suit for rolled-up sleeves, surprising her by helping lay groundwork alongside volunteers. For Dorian, it was a turning point. For the first time, he wasn't leading from an office tower or a boardroom. He was working shoulder to shoulder with people who cared less about his last name and more about his commitment. It was there that he realized Sabrina was more than a partner. She was someone who changed how he saw the world. When he proposed, it wasn't in the middle of a grand party or at an exclusive retreat. He chose the Westin Peachtree Plaza, where the city stretched beneath them in a full circle of light. Standing in the revolving restaurant at the top, Dorian pulled out a simple velvet box and asked her to marry him. Sabrina's yes was immediate, her voice steady, her eyes filled with trust. Their wedding in Buckhead was glamorous, as expected of someone in Dorian's position, but Sabrina insisted on touches that reflected their shared values. A portion of the budget was donated to housing programs, and instead of endless luxury, the celebration balanced elegance with meaning. Guests remembered the way Sabrina's vows spoke directly to building not just a life together, but a life that mattered to others. Married life began with excitement. They bought a stately home in Tuxedo Park, not just a mansion filled with expensive art, but a space where Sabrina's designs could shine. She filled it with light, color, and warmth, blending modern touches with classic Southern charm. Together, they began merging their professional strengths. Caldwell Properties investing in eco-friendly projects under Sabrina's influence, and Sabrina gaining access to larger platforms where her ideas could take root. For a time, it seemed like the perfect partnership: love, respect, and purpose intertwined. Dorian had found not only a wife but a partner who challenged him, grounded him, and opened his world in ways he had never imagined. Sabrina, in turn, had found a man willing to listen, to evolve, and to share her vision. What neither of them realized was that their happiness was being quietly observed, and not everyone celebrated their union. Eleanor Caldwell had always carried herself as the picture of Southern refinement. Her posture was perfect, her pearls flawless, her smile gracious, but behind that carefully polished image was a heart resistant to change. When Dorian introduced Sabrina as the woman he intended to marry, Eleanor's response was warm on the surface, yet her eyes told another story. To her friends in Buckhead society, Eleanor spoke of Sabrina with faint praise, calling her spirited or independent, words that sounded complimentary but carried quiet edges. At family dinners, her tone was polite but cool, never openly confrontational. She would ask about Sabrina's work, only to add comments like, "That must be difficult for someone with your background," or, "I hope you're not taking on too much for a young woman like yourself." Sabrina, raised to value respect, kept her composure. She answered with grace, even when Eleanor's words stung. But Dorian noticed the tension. He would glance between them, sensing that his mother's hospitality was laced with subtle rejection. He wanted to believe Eleanor only needed time to accept Sabrina, yet deep down, he felt the sharpness in her tone. Eleanor's disapproval was rooted not in Sabrina's character, but in prejudice. Sabrina was a black woman entering a world Eleanor believed should remain untouched by those outside her circle. Eleanor never voiced it openly, but in private conversations with her closest friends, her feelings slipped through. At luncheons and garden parties, she would lean in, lowering her voice to suggest doubts about Sabrina's intentions. "She's ambitious," Eleanor would murmur. One has to wonder if she truly loves Dorian, or if she sees him as a step into society. Her friends, loyal to her, repeated those doubts in their own circles, planting seeds that spread quietly among Atlanta's elite. Soon, whispers about Sabrina followed her into rooms where she had never spoken. People questioned her motives, her loyalty, her background, never openly, always through hints and half-statements that carried weight. Despite the gossip, Sabrina remained focused on her work and her marriage. She and Dorian pushed forward with projects that blended their talents. For Sabrina, her commitment to community was unchanged. She wanted to design buildings that gave people dignity. For Dorian, every success they shared was proof that their union was strong. But Eleanor was relentless in her subtle campaign. At family gatherings, she would offer backhanded compliments. "Sabrina, you've done well for yourself, given where you came from." At dinners, she would raise concerns about Sabrina's family, asking if they had the right connections, if they could fit in with Atlanta's circles of power. Each remark seemed small on its own, but over time, they formed a steady pattern. Dorian defended Sabrina when he noticed, but the constant push wore him down. He wanted harmony between the two most important women in his life, yet Eleanor's quiet persistence chipped away at his peace of mind. The breaking point came during what should have been a joyful moment. Sabrina stood in their Tuxedo Park home, her hands resting protectively over her stomach, her eyes shining as she told Dorian she was pregnant. He embraced her, overwhelmed with excitement at the thought of becoming a father. For both of them, it felt like a new chapter, a chance to expand the family they had built. When they shared the news with Eleanor, her response was carefully staged. She smiled, congratulated them, and even hugged Sabrina. But in her heart, panic rose. A grandchild meant permanence. This child would carry Sabrina's blood into the Caldwell name, a future Eleanor could not control or erase. That night, Eleanor sat alone in her Buckhead estate, sipping wine, her mind racing. She convinced herself that Sabrina was a threat not only to Dorian but to the family's reputation. Her disapproval hardened into determination. While the city celebrated Dorian and Sabrina as a power couple blending influence and vision, Eleanor began quietly preparing a plan. Her prejudice, once hidden behind polite words and practiced smiles, would soon drive her to cross a line that could never be undone. Eleanor Caldwell was not the type to make her moves in anger. She preferred patience, calculation, and precision. When her polite remarks and whispered doubts failed to separate Dorian from Sabrina, she decided she needed proof or something that would not only plant suspicion but confirm it. Proof she could control. To create it, Eleanor turned to Ray Hutchinson, a discreet but highly paid consultant who had once handled questionable crisis cleanups for Atlanta's wealthy. Ray wasn't a criminal in the traditional sense, but he knew how to manipulate records, forge documents, and leave behind trails that looked authentic. For the right price, he could bend reality. Eleanor offered him more than money. She offered him influence and access to Caldwell Properties' future projects. Ray agreed, setting into motion the deception that would tear a family apart. Ray's first step was subtle. He obtained copies of Sabrina's professional correspondence and financial statements. From there, he began altering them. A forged email suggesting kickbacks from contractors, a bank record adjusted to show unaccounted deposits, and architectural invoices rewritten to imply double billing. The details were small, but together they painted a picture of misconduct that looked undeniable. Eleanor reviewed every page, her face calm as she sipped tea in her study. The lies didn't disturb her. She convinced herself she was protecting her son. To her, Sabrina's success was a threat, and removing her was a necessity. Weeks later, Eleanor visited Dorian in his office, carrying a neatly organized folder. She placed it on his desk with the same composure she used when discussing charity events or board meetings. "I don't want to interfere, darling," she began, her voice soft. "But I've come across some things that worry me." Inside the folder were the documents Ray had crafted. Emails showing supposed secret communications with contractors. Statements suggesting hidden funds. Invoices that implied manipulation. Eleanor didn't accuse directly. She only suggested, "I know you trust her, but sometimes people are not who they seem. I just don't want you hurt." For Dorian, the impact was immediate. At first, he rejected the thought outright. Sabrina was loyal, passionate, and deeply committed to her work. But the papers were in his hands. The numbers looked real. The signatures matched. The evidence wasn't a whisper. It was printed proof. That night, he sat alone in their Tuxedo Park home, staring at the papers spread across his desk. Sabrina was in the next room, reading through baby name lists, humming softly. Dorian should have joined her, shared her joy, but his mind was locked on the possibility that his mother might be right. Sleep became a stranger. He would lie awake, turning over every conversation he'd had with Sabrina. Had she ever seemed distracted when money was mentioned? Had she ever avoided questions about her projects? The doubt grew quietly, eating away at the trust they had built. Sabrina noticed the change. She asked why he was distant, why his eyes seemed clouded even when he smiled. He gave vague answers, too much work, too many projects, but she felt the weight of something unsaid. Meanwhile, Eleanor maintained her mask of concern. At family dinners, she asked subtle questions in front of Dorian, planting more doubt. "How are your projects going, Sabrina? I hope you're keeping everything balanced. It must be hard managing so much at once." Her words were harmless on the surface, but to Dorian, they echoed the accusations hidden in the documents he had seen. As Sabrina's pregnancy progressed, the tension in their home deepened. She decorated the nursery with care, choosing calming colors and arranging small clothes with joy. Dorian joined her, but his smile felt strained. At night, when she rested her head on his chest, he lay awake, his eyes open, haunted by the evidence Eleanor had delivered. The man who once found strength in Sabrina's presence now questioned her loyalty. Each forged line on those documents became another crack in the foundation of their marriage. Eleanor's plan was working. Dorian's love was colliding with suspicion, and slowly, trust was giving way to fear. The breaking point came one late evening in their Buckhead living room. Rain tapped against the wide windows, the glow of the city lights filtering through, while Sabrina sat curled on the sofa with her hand resting gently on her swollen stomach. She looked peaceful, flipping through design sketches she had been working on for her firm. Dorian stood a few steps away, his expression tight, the folder of forged evidence clutched in his hand. He had rehearsed the words over and over in his head, but when he finally spoke, his voice cracked with tension. "Sabrina, I need to ask you something, and I need the truth." She looked up, startled by his tone. "Of course. What's wrong?" Dorian placed the papers on the coffee table between them. His hands shook slightly as he pushed them toward her. These are your accounts, your emails. Tell me they aren't real." Sabrina picked up the first page, confusion turning quickly into disbelief. She scanned the so-called proof of misconduct, altered invoices, fake emails, false statements, and her face paled. "Dorian, these are lies. None of this is mine. You can't believe this." But the doubt had already taken root in him. "Then how do you explain it? The signatures match. The dates, the numbers, they all connect. I don't want to believe it, Sabrina, but—" His voice trailed off, heavy with pain. She set the papers down, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't need to explain something I didn't do. You know me. You know my work. You know my heart. How can you even ask me this?" Her words cut deep, but Dorian couldn't silence the storm in his mind. Eleanor's warnings echoed, the forged documents staring back at him like undeniable proof. He wanted to believe her, but every page felt like another strike against his trust. The argument swelled. Sabrina's voice shook as she pleaded. "I left everything to be with you. I stood beside you in every boardroom, every project, every moment people doubted us. And now, when I need you to trust me most, you're choosing to believe lies." Dorian's eyes glistened with tears he tried to hold back. "I'm not choosing lies. I'm trying to protect us, to protect what we've built. But I can't ignore what's in front of me." For a long moment, silence filled the room. The distance between them felt larger than the walls of the grand house they had built together. Sabrina stood slowly, placing a hand on her stomach, as though shielding the child within her. Her voice steadied, quiet but firm. "If you can look at me, the mother of your child, and still doubt my loyalty, then we don't have a marriage anymore." Dorian's face crumpled with regret, but he said nothing. His silence spoke louder than any defense. Sabrina walked to their bedroom, gathering a few essentials. When she returned, her overnight bag was slung over her shoulder. She paused at the door, her eyes locking with his. "One day you'll see the truth. I only hope it won't be too late." With that, she left, her footsteps echoing against the marble floors, her dignity intact despite the tears streaming down her face. When the door closed, the silence was unbearable. Dorian sank onto the sofa, his hands buried in his hair, realizing the weight of what had just happened. Yet even then, he couldn't let go of the forged doubts in his mind. Across town, Eleanor received the news with a measured calm. Alone in her estate, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Her plan had worked. Sabrina was gone, and Dorian was back under her shadow. But when she spoke to others, her tone was soft, full of rehearsed sorrow. To friends and acquaintances, she said she only wanted peace for her son, whom she prayed for reconciliation. In public, she played the role of the concerned mother. In private, she savored her triumph. The city lights of downtown Atlanta became Sabrina's refuge. After leaving the Buckhead home, she checked into the Ritz-Carlton under her maiden name. The staff, discreet and professional, offered her the privacy she desperately needed. From her suite's tall windows, she could see Peachtree Street glowing with winter traffic, but inside, silence wrapped around her. She carried her child with dignity, even in loneliness. Though heartbroken, she refused to be broken. Each morning, she rose early, setting up her laptop and phone across the hotel desk, determined to fight back. It was here that she reached out to Harrison and Associates, one of the city's most respected legal and investigative firms. Within hours of hearing her story, they agreed to take her case. They promised to examine the documents, track the financial trails, and uncover how her reputation had been destroyed. For Sabrina, this was more than survival. It was about reclaiming truth. Nights were the hardest. Alone in her suite, she replayed every argument with Dorian, every moment where his eyes carried doubt instead of love. She often placed her hand over her belly, whispering to her unborn child, "You are not a mistake. You are my reason to keep going." Those words gave her strength when everything else threatened to pull her down. As weeks passed, the investigation gained momentum. Harrison's team found suspicious wire transfers, cash withdrawals, and digital fingerprints pointing directly to Eleanor's circle. Though the evidence wasn't yet ready for court, Sabrina knew the tide was beginning to turn. The turning point came during a rare Atlanta snowstorm. Northside Hospital stood ready as the city's roads froze, and ambulances cut carefully through icy streets. Sabrina was rushed into labor earlier than expected. The hospital staff treated her with tenderness, aware she was alone but never letting her feel abandoned. Hours of exhaustion gave way to the first cries of a newborn girl. Sabrina, tears streaming down her cheeks, cradled her daughter against her chest. She whispered, "Grace. Your name is Grace." She chose her maiden name, Mitchell, for the birth certificate. It was not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. Grace Mitchell would grow with the security of her mother's name, unburdened by the doubts and betrayals that had torn the Caldwells apart. Across town, Eleanor learned of the birth before Dorian did. She wasted no time seizing control of the moment. Over tea at her estate, she pressed her son with gentle but firm persuasion. She left. "Dorian, she has chosen a life apart from you. Running to her at the hospital will only complicate matters. Give her space." Let her raise this child without dragging you into more public scrutiny. Her words struck the exact chord of shame already straining him. Exhausted from sleepless nights, drowning in doubt and regret, Dorian gave in. He did not drive through the snow to Northside Hospital. He did not hold his daughter that night. Instead, he sat alone in his office, staring at the phone that never rang. Sabrina noticed his absence, but not with surprise. She had expected it. In truth, she found a quiet clarity in those hours. Holding Grace, she understood that the love she once begged for from Dorian was now unnecessary. Her daughter's small heartbeat against her chest was enough. The days following Grace's birth were filled with both tenderness and resolve. Visitors from her small circle of loyal friends brought flowers and warm meals. Harrison and associates kept her updated on their findings. Nurses remarked how Sabrina never once looked defeated. Her body was tired, but her spirit never wavered. As Atlanta thawed from its snowstorm, Sabrina left Northside with Grace in her arms, returning to her temporary suite downtown. She carried her newborn past photographers who had caught whispers of the story but offered them no statement. She walked firmly, the weight of her child reminding her that dignity was her greatest shield. Dorian, meanwhile, avoided questions from colleagues and the press. He told himself it was temporary, that he needed time to think, that rushing to the hospital would only make matters worse. But deep down, he knew he had made a mistake that could never be undone. Grace's first nights at the Ritz-Carlton were quiet but filled with resolve. Sabrina rocked her to sleep while reviewing updates from her legal team. Harrison's investigators confirmed that Eleanor had not only paid for the forged documents but had also recorded private conversations with Dorian, subtly feeding his insecurities. The pattern was clear. The truth was within reach. For Sabrina, those findings were fuel. She no longer cried when she thought of her lost marriage. She no longer longed for Dorian's hand beside hers. Instead, she poured every ounce of her energy into protecting her daughter and preparing for the storm of justice that was about to sweep through Atlanta's highest courts. Grace was her anchor, her proof that love could survive betrayal. Every time Sabrina looked at her daughter's tiny face, she knew the future would not be defined by Eleanor's cruelty or Dorian's weakness. It would be defined by resilience. The courthouse in downtown Atlanta was packed. Fulton County Superior Court had seen its share of high-profile disputes, but this case was different. At the center stood Sabrina, no longer the quiet, wronged wife, but a woman armed with proof. Her legal team from Harrison and Associates presented documents, recordings, and financial ledgers with precision. Piece by piece, the false accusations that had once broken her marriage were dismantled in front of the judge. The evidence was damning. Transfers from Eleanor's private accounts to Ray Hutchinson, the consultant who had manufactured fraudulent records, were traced and authenticated. Forensic experts testified about doctored emails and altered spreadsheets, showing how they had been planted to discredit Sabrina. Even more striking were the recordings of subtle conversations Eleanor had engineered with Dorian, carefully feeding his doubts while presenting herself as a concerned mother. Every word, every receipt, every digital fingerprint painted a clear picture. Sabrina had been targeted. The courtroom atmosphere shifted from skepticism to outrage. Observers who had once whispered about Sabrina's supposed misconduct now sat in silence, realizing the magnitude of the injustice. Eleanor, dressed in her tailored suit, sat stiffly, her expression a mask that could no longer hide the crumbling of her carefully crafted image. For Sabrina, the vindication was bittersweet. She was cleared in the eyes of the law, but her marriage had already collapsed under the weight of lies. Still she stood tall, refusing to let grief overshadow the truth. When the judge acknowledged the evidence as credible and admissible, Sabrina knew she had reclaimed her name. While the courtroom shook with revelation, across town, Dorian sat in his Buckhead office. It was a typical weekday morning filled with board reports, project updates, and a long table crowded with senior executives. Caldwell Properties was already under pressure from declining revenue, but Dorian forced himself to focus. His pen hovered over contracts when his assistant entered the room, carrying a manila envelope. She placed it quietly at his side. Dorian opened it without thought, expecting financial papers or another set of proposals. Instead, his eyes met the first line, "Petition for divorce." His breath caught. He read Sabrina's name, the case number, and the firm representing her. For a moment, the room seemed to fade. Conversations around the table dulled, replaced by a rushing in his ears. The papers fell from his hands onto the polished wood. Executives glanced nervously at one another as their CEO, normally so composed, pressed his palms against his face. He excused himself abruptly, leaving the room in stunned silence. Behind his office door, he sank into his leather chair, staring blankly at the wall. The finality of it hit harder than he had imagined. He hadn't lost Sabrina to scandal, he had lost her to his own failure to trust. The news spread quickly. By evening, Atlanta's business journals reported not only the divorce but also the revelations from court. Headlines carried Eleanor's name alongside accusations of fraud and manipulation. Her once influential standing in the city's social and philanthropic circles was shattered overnight. Investors pulled back from Caldwell Properties, wary of further fallout. Shareholders demanded explanations. Eleanor tried to present herself as misunderstood, but recordings of her words left no room for interpretation. Her polite veneer had been stripped away. Her empire of influence crumbled as allies distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with scandal. For Dorian, the professional damage was secondary to the personal devastation. He spent nights in his office, staring at framed photographs that once symbolized happiness. A wedding portrait, now more painful than joyful. A picture of him and Sabrina at the Beltline, laughing in a moment that seemed like a lifetime ago. He thought of Grace, the daughter he had never gone to meet, and the weight of that decision pressed heavily against his chest. Colleagues noticed the change in him. His suits, once pressed and immaculate, began to look less sharp. Meetings dragged as his focus faltered. He drank more coffee, slept less, and carried a quiet despair that no one dared address directly. He was a man who had been handed everything: love, family, a legacy, and had watched it slip through his fingers because he had allowed doubt to guide him. Sabrina, meanwhile, moved forward with a quiet determination. She signed the final documents without bitterness, only resolve. She had endured betrayal, humiliation, and loneliness, but she emerged with dignity intact. Grace's tiny hands reaching for her face reminded her each day of what truly mattered. The divorce proceedings, combined with Eleanor's exposed fraud, left Atlanta society reeling. Dinner parties that once welcomed Eleanor now excluded her name from guest lists. Fundraising committees that had courted her influence now distanced themselves entirely. Even former friends, fearful of reputational damage, stopped returning her calls. The scandal reached national coverage, with business magazines labeling it a cautionary tale of pride and prejudice within elite families. Caldwell Properties' market value plummeted, banks tightened credit, and projects stalled. 4 years, the company had been a pillar of Atlanta's real estate scene. Now, it was on the verge of collapse, weighed down by the reckless actions of its matriarch. Eleanor retreated to her estate, curtains drawn, calls unanswered. For a woman who had once thrived on power and appearances, isolation was her cruelest punishment. But even in her silence, the damage she had inflicted remained irreversible. For Dorian, the loss was twofold: a marriage destroyed and a family name tarnished. Sitting alone late into the night, he realized the cost of his weakness. He had allowed himself to be swayed by whispers and paper trails, forgetting the strength of the woman who had once stood by his side. He could never take back the moment he confronted Sabrina with lies. He could never undo the decision not to go to the hospital. Those choices would haunt him for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, Sabrina looked ahead. She no longer glanced back at what had been taken from her. She focused on building a future where Grace would grow without the shadows of betrayal. Her innocence had been restored, but more importantly, her spirit had been proven unbreakable. Sabrina stood in the lobby of a modest office building on Peachtree Street, holding Grace in one arm and a folder of sketches in the other. The years of pain had not broken her. They had refined her. With her marriage behind her and her name cleared, she was ready to build something lasting, not just for herself, but for her daughter and for the city she still loved. She founded Mitchell Design Studios, using her maiden name as both a shield and a statement. The firm's mission was clear: create sustainable, affordable housing that gave dignity to families too often overlooked in Atlanta's booming development market. What began with one rented office, a handful of dedicated colleagues, and a stack of blueprints soon grew into a respected voice in the architectural community. Sabrina's work spoke for itself. Her first completed project, a cluster of eco-friendly townhomes in East Atlanta, received praise for its balance of beauty and function. Local families moved in, grateful for homes that were affordable, modern, and built with care. From there, opportunities multiplied. Universities invited her to lecture. Nonprofits sought her expertise. Articles in design magazines highlighted her as both a visionary architect and a resilient woman who had rebuilt her life from the ground up. Through it all, Grace remained her anchor. Sabrina juggled site visits with school pickups, design meetings with bedtime stories. There were nights when exhaustion pressed heavily on her shoulders, but one look at Grace's smile reminded her why she kept going. To the world, Sabrina was an accomplished architect. To Grace, she was simply Mom, and that was her proudest title. Across town, Dorian lived with the weight of choices he could not undo. The divorce had left him hollow, but the revelation of his mother's deceit carved the wound deeper. He had tried to reach Sabrina, sending letters, leaving messages, even appearing at her office unannounced. Each attempt ended the same way, with a polite but firm rejection. Sabrina had no anger in her voice when she turned him away, only certainty. "You made your choice, Dorian. Grace and I are moving forward." Desperation turned to reflection. For the first time, Dorian sought therapy. Sitting in the quiet of a counselor's office, he began to confront not only his mother's influence but his own weakness. He admitted to the guilt that haunted him, the shame of having abandoned Sabrina in her most vulnerable moment, the regret of missing Grace's first days of life. Therapy did not erase the past, but it forced him to face it. In time, Dorian redirected his pain into action. He began speaking publicly about the importance of trust, bias, and accountability in relationships and in business. He partnered with nonprofits that promoted fair housing and funded programs supporting single parents. Some viewed his efforts as an attempt at redemption, others as genuine growth. For Dorian, it was both ways to atone, even if forgiveness never came. Yet despite his outreach, the one door that mattered most stayed closed. Sabrina remained cordial but distant. Grace, growing taller and more curious each year, knew of her father only through occasional headlines or the rare mentions Sabrina allowed. Dorian attended public events where Sabrina spoke, sitting quietly at the back, listening, his heart swelling with pride and sorrow at the same time. He clapped, but he never approached her afterward. He knew the line had been drawn too clearly to cross. While Sabrina and Dorian forged their separate paths, Eleanor's world collapsed. Her name, once synonymous with wealth and status, became shorthand for disgrace. Neighbors who once waved across manicured lawns now turned away. Invitations that used to arrive weekly stopped altogether. Her once bustling calendar of luncheons, galas, and charity auctions was replaced by silence. But social isolation was only the beginning. Legal proceedings followed, spurred by the fraudulent actions she had orchestrated against Sabrina. Investigators uncovered the extent of her payments to Ray Hutchinson, the manipulation of company funds, and her role in manufacturing false evidence. Court hearings forced her to sit silently while lawyers dissected her schemes, stripping away the last remnants of her credibility. The consequences were devastating. She was fined heavily, forced to sell assets to cover damages, and barred from holding any leadership position in Caldwell Properties. Her influence in Atlanta high society, once unquestioned, dissolved completely. By the time Grace celebrated her 3rd birthday, Eleanor was living in near solitude. She spent her days wandering her empty estate, the silence broken only by the occasional call from her attorney. Dorian visited her rarely. Their once close bond had fractured beyond repair. In his eyes, she was no longer the protective mother who had raised him, but the architect of his downfall. Conversations were strained, filled with unspoken blame. Eleanor would defend herself. "I only wanted to protect you, Dorian." But the words rang hollow. He could not reconcile her intentions with the devastation she had caused. Meanwhile, Sabrina thrived. Mitchell Design Studios expanded, taking on larger projects that reshaped neighborhoods. Her designs became known not just for efficiency, but for the warmth they brought to communities. She was recognized at award ceremonies, honored by civic groups, and invited to serve on panels shaping Atlanta's future. Yet she remained grounded, always returning home to Grace, always prioritizing the quiet life they built together. At every milestone, she carried herself with grace and dignity. She never gloated over Eleanor's downfall or Dorian's regret. Instead, she focused on what she could control: her work, her daughter, and the future she was determined to create. For Dorian, redemption remained a journey without a destination. He worked tirelessly, gave generously, and spoke openly about the lessons he had learned. But at night, when the city lights flickered outside his apartment window, he knew what was missing could never be replaced. His success felt hollow without Sabrina's trust or Grace's laughter. For Eleanor, isolation became permanent. Once the center of attention, she became a forgotten name, remembered only as a cautionary tale of prejudice and manipulation. Her estate, though still grand, felt like a cage. She lived surrounded by reminders of a power she no longer held, haunted by the silence that came from choices she could never undo. Grace grew up shielded from the scars of her parents' painful history. Under Sabrina's steady care, she flourished and excelling in school, discovering her passion for design, and carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone deeply loved. Though she never knew her father closely, Sabrina ensured that Grace's life was built on truth, compassion, and opportunity, not secrets and shadows. Atlanta, too, had changed in the wake of the Caldwell scandal. The revelations of fraud and prejudice within its wealthiest circles sparked difficult conversations across the city. Families, churches, and community leaders were forced to confront the biases that had long lingered beneath polished facades. In that reckoning, Sabrina's resilience became a symbol of dignity. Her success was not just personal. It became part of a broader cultural shift, one that reminded Atlanta that true legacy is measured not by power, but by principle. Mitchell Design Studios became more than a firm. It was a movement. Specializing in sustainable housing, Sabrina's projects redefined modern architecture with purpose, balancing beauty with accessibility. Awards and recognition followed, but what meant most to her was seeing families thrive in spaces she helped bring to life. She had taken betrayal and transformed it into a foundation for justice and creativity. Meanwhile, Dorian Caldwell lived in the long shadow of regret. He tried to piece together a new life through therapy, community activism, and even public apologies. He fought tirelessly for causes, donated his fortune, and advocated for fairness in business. Yet the truth remained: he was forever excluded from the lives of Sabrina and Grace. Redemption for him became a journey without a destination, a man working to do good but always marked by the absence of the two people he had loved most. Eleanor's fate was harsher. Once a fixture of Atlanta high society, she now walked in isolation. Legal charges stripped her of wealth, influence, and reputation. Friends who once clung to her name turned their backs, unwilling to be tainted by her scandal. She became a cautionary tale, proof that deceit may win applause in the moment but cannot withstand the weight of truth. And so, as Grace stepped confidently into her future, Sabrina's legacy was clear. She was not defined by what was taken from her but by what she built in its place. Trust, prejudice, and resilience had shaped her journey, and through it, she had proven that dignity outlasts betrayal and love outshines scandal. What lesson do you take from Dorian and Sabrina's story? Perhaps it is that trust, once broken, leaves scars. Or that prejudice, left unchecked, poisons even the most beautiful of lives. But above all, maybe it is that resilience, the quiet strength to keep building, even on shattered ground, is what truly defines us. Thank you for watching until the end. Your support is the fuel that drives our passion to create compelling stories that matter. Each subscription tells us we're on the right path, and every comment reminds us why we do what we do. If you haven't yet, please hit that subscribe button. It means the world to us. And get ready, because another captivating story is on the horizon. One that will inspire, enlighten, and stay with you long after the video ends. Remember this: you are valued, you are loved, and you are always welcome in our community. Whether you're catching up on past stories or waiting eagerly for the next one, know that you are part of something special here. Until we meet again, may blessings follow you wherever you go. Take care, stay inspired, and keep that beautiful curiosity alive. See you soon, dear friend.